Right. So we're going to start in 1 minute. Can you hear me,
Okay,
Susie?
I can.
Could you
Thank you
hear
very
me?
much. Yeah.
Oh, Susie, we're ready to go.
Okay. Right, well, welcome everybody to this webinar hosted by Family Lives, which is the charity that really deals with all aspects of family life and everybody in a family. Parents, children, grandparents, aunts and uncles, whatever. We are there in support of anybody in that situation. And we are hosting this webinar on workplace bullying for quite a few reasons. One being that, of course, the strains and stresses of enduring workplace bullying actually rebound entirely onto family life as well. You don't leave the unpleasantness that's happening at work to your injury at the work floor. You bring it home with you, which means it affects families as well. And that's why we particularly get involved, because we hear a lot in families that are struggling with things like this and are asking us questions. And therefore, we thought, let's hold a seminar and let's get some advice, not just from myself, but also from a legal person. Let me introduce myself. My name is Susie Hayden. I'm a trustee of Family Lives and also of one of our other offshoots, William UK. I'm an agony aunt of Woman Magazine. I'm a parenting educator and I'm an author. And I do see an awful lot of things, a lot of letters in my particular work, in my postgrad, and also, as I said, coming into family life that deal. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our legal eagle, Deborah. Please introduce yourself and explain what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Susie. My name is Deborah Casali, and I'm a principal lawyer at Slater and Gordon Lawyers, and I specialise in employment law. And in my line of work, I see a lot of these types of cases. So I hope to be able to explain a few things to you today, to explain what you can do if you are being bullied and harassed at work. First of all, to just explain the kind of work that I do, I act for individual employees. So as a department, we concentrate on the individual employee rather than the employer. And so we're specialists in this area. And the sort of legal claims that we tend to see are constructive and unfair dismissal, discrimination cases, harassment, victimisation, and whistleblowing, to name a few of the claims. So I hope to be able to explain those to you in a little bit more detail so you know the sort of things to be looking out for. And then I want to concentrate on some practical advice and strategy. What should you do if you're being bullied at work? And then also talk a bit about resolution and in particular settlement agreements that often are the outcome of these kind of workplace issues. So first of all, constructive dismissal. It's really important to note that for a claim for constructive or unfair dismissal, you need to have 2 years service. So you need to have been employed by your employer for 2 years to be able to have a claim in this regard. There are other claims where you don't need to be employed for 2 years, but for this particular claim you do. So with a constructive dismissal case, this occurs when an employee terminates the contract under which they are employed with or without notice, so with serving your notice or not, in circumstances in which they are entitled to terminate it without notice by reason of the employer's conduct. So what that actually means is that there must be a repudiatory breach, so a really serious fundamental breach on the part of the employer, um, and an election by the employee to accept the breach and treat the contract as an end. And the employee must resign in response to the breach. It's also really important to bear in mind not to delay too long in accepting breach. What that means is that if you've continued to work for your employer after the breach has happened, you could be deemed to have waived the breach by just continuing to work. So in an employment contract, there is an implied term of mutual trust and confidence. And if your employer has breached that mutual trust and confidence, that can entitle you, as I say, to resign. But it's really important that you take advice before resigning. The reason for that is I've had many clients come to me when they've already resigned and perhaps the resignation letter hasn't been drafted in the best possible way. So it's very important to take advice early on and consider your options rather than just in the heat of the moment resigning, and that may not be the best strategic thing to do for your case. The timing of the resignation, as I've said, is also really important. So with regards to if you've continued to work for the employer and it can be said, well, you've just waived the breach, that can be an issue. It's getting that timing right of the resignation, and it can be quite a technical area of law and something to certainly seek advice on. You may want to raise a grievance, and that's something that I get involved a lot with employees, raising internal grievances. You might think, well, how can an external lawyer raise a grievance on my behalf? Well, we can do that, and we do get involved in helping clients with their grievances or with their grievance appeals. And I'll talk a bit more about that later on when I talk about practical advice. In terms of what you might get out of a potential claim in an employment tribunal for constructive unfair dismissal, the remedy you're looking at is the same, whether it's constructive dismissal or whether it's unfair dismissal. The remedy is based in unfair dismissal. And what that means is that you get a basic award, which is equivalent to statutory redundancy pay, so not very much, and a compensatory award, which is at the moment capped at 76,574 or 1 year's salary, whichever is the lower of those two amounts. That cap is increasing on the 6th of April slightly, but it's important to bear in mind that damages are capped for that kind of a claim. With discrimination cases, you don't need to have the 2 years period of service that I talked about. Discrimination comes in many forms. It's unfair treatment in some way related to a characteristic, protected characteristic. So sort of cases that we deal with, maybe age, disability, race discrimination, and there's a list of them on the slide that you can see. Discrimination isn't always obvious. Some cases are more obvious than others. There may be subconscious bias going on in the mind of the employer. There may be statistical evidence that you can use to show bias and discrimination within the organisation. And there is no cap in terms of damages here. So you could be looking potentially at uncapped losses flowing from the Discriminatory Act. And what that means is your loss of earnings as a result of the discrimination, plus an award for injury to feelings, which can be up to £30,000, although in many cases it's a lot less than that. So that's how it works. You don't. The important thing to remember is you don't need the 2 years, and you can get uncapped damages based on loss of earnings. And discrimination law also covers all areas of employment, from job adverts through to dismissal and giving a reference. So it's quite a wide scope there. Harassment in itself, talking about bullying and harassment, isn't a claim that you can just bring in the employment tribunal as a freestanding claim. Harassment has got to be linked to a protected characteristic. And it's where a person engages in unwanted conduct which is related to one or more of the protected characteristics that I just mentioned on the previous slide, and which has the purpose or effect of violating the dignity of another person or creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating or offensive environment. And it may be one or a series of acts. And often where we have discrimination cases, there may be a harassment element to the case as well. Particularly when you think about creating an intimidating environment, or hostile environment, then that's obviously quite a wide wide scope there. So we would look at that as well. Sexual harassment, of course, as well is a separate type of harassment in itself. And it occurs when a person engages in any unwanted verbal, non-verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature, which again violates a person's dignity or creates an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating or offensive environment for that person. Victimisation is also again linked to discrimination, and victimisation occurs where an employee has done or intends to do what we call a protected act. And what that means is if you've raised a complaint about your employer, you may have brought discrimination proceedings even, or given evidence or information with discrimination proceedings, or raised a complaint or a grievance regarding discrimination, and then you are victimised because you have done that protected act. That's a separate head of claim. So that's again something that we would look into. Whistleblowing, you've probably heard quite a lot about whistleblowing in the news. This is, again, a specific type of claim. You don't need the 2 years qualification, just as for discrimination. And this is legislation is designed to protect workers who are concerned about malpractice at work and who disclose information about their employer's activities in the public interest. And this is called whistleblowing. And the information disclosed must relate to a criminal offence, a failure to comply with a legal obligation, a miscarriage of justice, a health and safety issue, damage to the environment, or an attempt to cover up any of the above. And if your employer treats you badly as a result of your whistleblowing, or indeed dismisses you, then you've got a cause of action there. So it's quite, again, a technical area of law, and it's something, if you're concerned about, to seek advice on. Again, you've got uncapped compensation plus injury to feelings awards that may be awarded. And you should also check your whistleblowing policy, and again take advice at an early stage before even in some cases making the actual disclosures. So in terms of practical advice and strategy, this is just as important as the legal considerations that I've mentioned. And when clients come to see us, we want firstly to know what their objectives are. Are they hoping to have an internal resolution, perhaps find another job internally, or resolve the issue with their line manager, for example? Or are they actually really looking for an exit strategy? We've also got to bear in mind mitigation prospects. If an employee is likely to find a job very, very quickly, and isn't really going to have any loss, then there's no real value in bringing a claim. And that would be something to discuss and be thinking about. In all these types of cases, it's a good idea to keep a log of events. Perhaps there's been an email chain, perhaps there have been verbal instances of bullying, but you should certainly be printing off those bullying emails, and also keeping a detailed log of what's being said in meetings and so on. As I say, you may be looking at internal mediation and HR to try and find some sort of internal resolution to the bullying and harassment. Those cases are unusual in my experience. I tend to see more exits rather than internal resolutions, but it is of course possible to sometimes resolve these issues but before they actually involve an exit. Consider timing of your in all of this strategic advice. We will look at timing. Are you about to be paid a bonus? Is it a good idea to be raising a grievance just before a bonus is about to be paid? That type of consideration, we would be thinking about those aspects as well. And as I said earlier, raising a grievance, and then if that grievance isn't upheld, raising a grievance appeal are very common procedures that we get involved in advising with, and either with a view to finding that internal resolution, or as leverage for discussing an exit strategy with your employer. So have a look at the policies, have a look at the handbook, and your company may have a bullying and harassment policy. You should certainly have a grievance policy, and there may be an equality and diversity policy as well. But familiarise yourself with those policies. If you do go to a grievance meeting, or indeed if you go to a disciplinary meeting, if your employer is trying to discipline you, then you do have the right to be accompanied. You may take a union rep or work colleague with you. Many clients we find don't often want to take work colleagues with them because it's putting colleagues potentially in a difficult situation. So a union is a good option. If you're not part of a union, we do have a union that we use to provide independent trade union officials to attend those grievance and disciplinary meetings. So just because you're not a member of a union doesn't mean you can't get support. As I said, take legal advice at an early stage before things get out of hand. Check to see if you've got legal expenses insurance. You may have that on your house or contents policies. Sometimes people have the cover without even realising that they do. So it's worth checking that, and you may be able to get your claim covered. And then as a last resort, and in most cases it really is a last resort, bringing a claim in the employment tribunal or county court, depending on what the claim is. Most of the time it will be employment tribunal claim. Then that is something to obviously seriously consider. There are very strict time limits for bringing claims in the employment tribunal in particular, and that's another reason to take advice very early on. For example, in a discrimination claim, you've only got 3 months less 1 day for an act of discrimination to be able to bring that type of claim in the employment tribunal. You've got 3 months less 1 day to bring a claim for unfair dismissal from the date of termination. So you've got to move quite quickly to be able to provide instructions and to seek that advice at an early stage, bearing in mind those very stringent time limits. Settlement agreements. This is something that I wanted to raise because, as I say, employers are often able to reach an agreement to compromise claims on the termination of employment. They used to be known as compromise agreements. You may be familiar with that term, but they're really the same thing. Again, we would look at negotiation strategy and how to get the best settlement in the circumstances, what's realistic, etc. Negotiating legal fees. Sometimes a contribution towards legal fees is made in a settlement agreement. That's quite common. Look at things like tax and also other clauses in there so that your employer can't make derogatory comments about you after you've left. Confidentiality, references, and so on, and those are all really important considerations for clients, particularly when there's been an acrimonious situation. So as well as the financial settlement, we're looking at those non-financial terms as well. And that brings me to the close of my presentation. I know there are some questions that have come in. If we go to the first question, which hopefully you'll be able to see on the screen. This involves an employee who was sent hate mail and received anonymous calls from another person on the committee. The employee in this question found that the committee did nothing to protect him or her, and they're wondering whether they should have taken it further. Well, the short answer is possibly you could have taken it further. As I mentioned earlier, you could have raised a grievance and so on. Whether that would have improved the position or not is difficult to say. A grievance certainly does give some more leverage and to your complaint, but I obviously don't have the details of how long you were employed for and so on. But I think sometimes as well, find clients decide not to go down the grievance route or not to take it further for health reasons, and that of course is completely understandable. So in that case, I think possibly the answer is yes, but obviously sometimes the stress can be too much, and employees do do sometimes decide to leave. Susie, I don't know if you want to come in now and add anything to that question.
Absolutely, yes.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I think what I
picked out
particularly of one of the things that you said, actually, Deborah, was about early on. I think the earlier you do something, the better, whether it's going for legal help or whether it's actually just saying something. And one of the things I think I would like to sort of say very strongly is that it's important, in a sense, to change your mindset about what is happening when you are being bullied, when you are having a stressful situation where you feel that you know people are getting at you, that all sorts of things are happening. What is actually occurring when somebody bullies you is that they're taking your power away from you. They're making themselves the strong person over you, and taking your power away from you. And it's very easy to really sort of go along with this and actually, in a sense, give up your power. It's almost as if you become complicit in the bullying because you give your power away. So it is quite important for people to recognise that when somebody is bullying you, the person who has the problem is them, not you. It's not that you are a bad person, an incompetent person, any of that sort of thing. They have the problem. They're doing the bullying. And really thinking about it in those terms, and perhaps talking to somebody about it in those terms, can make you feel stronger and can make you feel better. And so I think it is quite important to, if necessary, talk to someone. If it's somebody, if you can't find a friend who can help you, a family member who can help you. Family life, that's what family life is there to do. I understood that I wasn't being heard very well in the beginning, so let me just sort of reiterate that what Family Lives is a charity that supports anybody in a family life, and that can be parents, it can be young people, it can be grandparents, whatever, because it's going to affect you at home as well as work. This is an organisation where you can come to. Coming on a helpline, talking to people about it, can help you get that mindset back, and perhaps help you get into a situation where you may then think about maybe taking legal action. You may not need to, because you may be able to stand up to the people who are bullying you. It's quite interesting that a lot of the times when you say to someone, that is unacceptable. I just, that is, have you heard what you've just said to me? That is not an acceptable thing to say. Please do not say it. Standing up to them in that way actually makes them stop and think. Because sometimes people genuinely don't realise what they're doing to you. Would you agree with that, Deborah?
Yes, absolutely, and I certainly find that clients want to talk and share the problems, and that's all part of what we do. I think sometimes employers have to exercise some caution with fighting back straight away, and I sometimes find that because employers are coming in somewhat of a state of flux, that they are perhaps reading into certain emails, the tone of certain emails that seem fairly innocuous to an outsider. It can lead to sort of feelings of paranoia that everything that a line manager is saying is critical.
It can seem quite innocuous to an outsider, perhaps, but obviously, if you feel it, it's worthwhile actually standing up and saying, I just don't find that acceptable.
What actually is going on here, because bullying can be quite subtle in my experience, and I think it's good to have a discussion about that, the nature of the bullying. I don't know if you agree with that, Susie.
I'm having sound problems.
I'm having sound problems. I think, unfortunately, quite a few of our participants are having sound problems, and so am I. Can you repeat the question, Deborah?
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, I can hear you.
Can you hear me? Yes. Can you just repeat your question to me?
Oh, yes. Sorry. My question was that I find with employees coming in sometimes that there can on occasion a bit of a feeling of aware that every single email that's sent is in some ways critical or in some ways bullying, and I think it's always good to have a discussion about the nature of the bullying, because it can be quite subtle, and if you're trying to sort of prove that in a tribunal, then you're going to need to the evidence is going to objectively need to stack up. So I think it is good to discuss it with somebody and actually get another take on it.
I would absolutely
agree with that.
Because you're quite right.
that often
It does seem a
it does seem a bit nebulous.
Talking
And
it over
talking
with
it over with someone else
keeping a
and
log
keeping a log is one of the most important things of all. Actually start writing down when you do feel
or
that
being-
people are being difficult with you, or being unpleasant
or
with you,
bullying.
or bullying you.
Keeping a
Start
log
keeping a log of exactly what is happening
and what your
and
feelings are
what your
about
feelings are about it, because in fact your feelings are important as well.
it.
So it's how this made you feel,
and
and what sort of difficulties this put you to.
keep that
If you
log
keep that log, and then you can start talking through exactly what you see is happening.
Yes, absolutely. I think keeping a log is great from a cathartic perspective as well as a legal perspective. So I would definitely agree with that. I'm just moving on to the next question. Hopefully you'll be able to see it on the screen. It's a really good question, this, I think, because it's talking about, it says one area that really bothers me is when you report it to management and they discredit the severity of your complaint and try and make it look like you're being oversensitive and overreacting to the bullying. What can you do in this type of situation? Yes, absolutely right. And often we see that grievances that go through and that aren't upheld, and the complainant feels very discredited by that. What I can say from a legal perspective is that we often see grievances that aren't upheld, or they may be upheld partially. They may be saying, oh yes, this could have perhaps been handled better, but overall we don't uphold your complaint, and that can make you feel very discredited in that way. So again, I think it's a case of thinking about, well, what do you want to achieve out of the situation? You may not be, it may not be realistic to think that you're going to get HR to agree to everything that you're saying, particularly if your managers are in positions of power. So I think it's a case of thinking about, well, what are you trying to achieve? Do you want to move on? If you're not being listened to, and what your options are, really. Susie, I'll pass over to you.
it might
also be worthwhile wondering whether even if the burden of proof was not there in a legal sense, in other words, if your complaint was not upheld, that you still might have been able to have put over a point that was important. And I find this, particularly, this is the cry of the bully down the ages. Oh, can't you take a joke? We were only joking. We didn't mean that. You were oversensitive. You took it the wrong way. I think that you need to ask yourself, before you make a complaint, what do you feel about this? Are you genuinely feeling, are you really having difficulties with what is being done or what is being said? Could you approach it a different way? Could you perhaps go away, talk to people, maybe strengthen your resolve, strengthen your self-confidence, face up to it, deal with it face to face? Or is it that you are saying, no, this is unacceptable behavior? And I think sometimes if you can say, I am absolutely certain this was unacceptable behavior, even if a court of law or a tribunal doesn't agree with you, you can still walk out of there feeling, I did the right thing, I stood up for myself, and that was actually worthwhile. I think there's quite a lot to do with, the sort of help that you could achieve. As I said, talking to someone like Family Live, talking to a counsellor perhaps. There's also a lot there that if you are being bullied, to think in terms of, as I said, strengthening your resolve. Maybe look at something like assertiveness training. Now, this is not to say that the problem is yours. There's nothing wrong with you that you're in this situation. As I said before, people who bully have a problem. They're the ones with the problem, and you need to recognize that, to say, look, you're the one with the problem, not me. But sometimes facing up to somebody who has a problem by saying, I'm not going to take this from you, I'm not going to be your scapegoat or your whipping boy, that in itself helps. So I think there's a range of support and help you need to be looking at, not just the legal, which is really important, but there's also the social. It's looking to friends and family and other people in your community, in your workplace also, who might listen to you, might support you, might be able to talk this through.
Susie, I completely agree with that. I'd just like to add one thing, is that I quite often see clients and they say, well, my 20 years of working, I've never had an issue with anybody before. And I think if you're in that sort of situation, you're probably not being oversensitive.
Yeah.
If you're doing this every 5 minutes, then you might want to be looking to that sort of help that we've talked about. But if it's a case where it's a particularly difficult individual, there may well be other colleagues of yours that agree with you that you're dealing with a particularly difficult individual. I think that can also strengthen your cause and your belief in your own complaint, if you like.
Well, exactly. I so agree with this. I think it is very difficult that often if you're in a bullying situation, you might find yourself surrounded by people who can see what's happening. Perhaps they themselves have experienced exactly the same, but they don't want to put their heads above the parapet because it's almost, well, phew, what a relief. If he's bullying her, he's not bullying me. And so they don't want to put themselves in the line of fire, or they don't want to run any risks. That's difficult. Perhaps this is the point where, one talks to people about, yes, but, this is a culture going on here. Everybody is suffering if one person is being bullied. Everybody actually takes the backlash, even if one person appears to be the central victim. So it is worthwhile talking to people who've been in the same situation to say, really, we need to end this once and for all, and we need to change the culture of the organisation so that it doesn't happen again with other people on either end, other people doing the bullying or other people being bullied. But I think you're quite right, Deborah, that if you know it's this is not the first time, that's a bit of a relief. You know it definitely is the other person. But I'd still say, even if you are someone who does find you were bullied at school, you're now being bullied at work, in a sense, because you are perhaps a quiet person, a person who doesn't stand up for themselves, bullies target you. Still, it's the bully who has the problem. They're offloading something on you to make, they think it's going to make themselves better, feel better. That's why bullies do this thing. If it's a work person who's stealing your work, as it were, stealing your credit, who's dumping on you to make themselves look good and you look bad, I repeat, it's still they who have the problem. And I think reframing it in your mind in that way can actually make you feel stronger and therefore less of a victim. What do you think, Deborah?
Yes, absolutely agree. And I think that those sorts of issues will come up with lots of the questions that we've got in here today. So just moving on to the next one. This is somebody who's been...
before we do that, Deborah, can I just come in? Just to sort of say, I think a specific thing here is when you do get into a situation where somebody is saying, this is not necessary, this is not a good idea, that actually says your comments were oversensitive and were silly. I think what you could try is a lovely technique which we call broken record, which is where you basically stand there and you say, I hear you say this, but this is how it is. You're saying that I'm being oversensitive. No, this is what is said to me, and it was unacceptable. You're saying that I'm being unreasonable. No, this is what it was done, and it is unreasonable. And as it were, keep repeating that until they hear you and stop telling you that you're being unreasonable, because you're not and you know it. Right, Deborah, sorry about that.
Being ignored or excluded and so on, and that's very often then proven to be the case. It is a case of writing it all down again, collecting your thoughts, your evidence. Have you got any emails? And again thinking about, well, have I got 2 years of service? Is there something that I can actually do legally, perhaps? And also, am I being discriminated against? Is it because I'm a woman that I'm being left out? Is it an all boys club? What is the issue at stake here? And certainly not to feel undermined by it. It sounds like a case of sort of two people ganging up together. But I think it's also helpful to think about the reasons why that might be. And that's when discrimination comes into it as well. Is it a discrimination issue? It may not be. Are they jealous of you? Are you a very strong performer at work? There may be a number of reasons, and I always like to find out what the story is behind the issue. I'll pass over to Susie now.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. The story behind the issue, and really, as you say, what is going on between these two persons, and what is going on between the whole group. I wonder sometimes in a situation like this whether challenging is actually quite useful. In other words, actually saying to the two, I overheard that conversation. I found it very hurtful. What did you mean by it? And you may find they were just gossiping, that this isn't part of a whole conspiracy, as it were. This was just two people maybe sort of trying to top each other with a little bit of gossip and and not really thinking about it, not realizing they were hurting your feelings because not realizing you were listening to them. So as I said, sometimes it is actually useful to challenge people directly and say, I overheard you say that. I found it quite hurtful. What did you mean by it?
Yes.
But yes, as somebody has actually suggested to her, what about approaching this by discussing it with her manager? In other words, these are the colleagues who were saying this. What about the manager? What about saying, it feels to me as if there's some bad blood going on, there's some things being said about me that I found very hurtful. How do I stand? And what do you think? And actually, so challenging what you feel is an overall perception, which may just be the perception of those two people. Deborah.
Yes, I completely agree with that, and it is very useful to hear about other tactics that you could employ where perhaps it doesn't escalate into a legal situation or even an internal grievance situation. And Susie's quite right. What's the line manager doing in all of this? And this is again where the politics comes in. If the line manager is particularly close to these two members of staff, then that may not be the best way of approaching it. So it's about understanding the story, understanding the politics. Can you resolve it internally, as Susie quite rightly says, before escalating it, really. Susie, should we move on to the next question now?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, absolutely.
It's quite a long question. Hopefully you can see it on the screen. This person's been bullied by their manager for the past 20 months. It doesn't say whether the person's been employed for longer than 20 months or not. There's been a series of incidents, including unacceptable workload and belittling and so on going on. Decisions made over the employee's head. And feeling like being set up to fail. Considering seeking advice regarding making a formal complaint. This is a really, really interesting question because it's something that we see a lot of. This issue of being set up to fail. Sometimes we have clients who are potentially facing performance management or even disciplinaries themselves and need support and advice in defending their position. So yes, definitely seeking advice regarding a complaint may be sensible because you may want to get a grievance in before any performance proceedings are commenced against you, and that's often a sensible thing to do rather than being on the back foot and finding yourself defending performance management. So I certainly think getting in there early, and this issue of being set up to fail, it comes up again and again, and we often see employees being threatened with performance improvement plans, with unrealistic targets, or vague targets, all sorts of ways that employers can try and paint a picture of you not performing when you may well be performing. So that's certainly something to seek some advice on. This particular person has felt that they're at their wits' end, and sought a meeting with a senior manager, but then that meeting was cancelled again. That sort of thing happens all the time. So it may well be at a stage in which to escalate it on a more formal footing, or seeking the support of HR, and taking things further. Susie.
Indeed,
and in fact, actually, Deborah, what she said was, which I was, it wasn't that it was cancelled. It was I was told it was not happening as I was suggesting, and need to work with this person. Clearly, what you've got here, well, it feels to me like is almost a seniority. In other words, the person is making life so difficult for the one who wrote to us it has prior, is there already. Probably also they're known to be someone who does this sort of thing. It really underlines the thing about keeping the log. You really do have to keep a log of what is happening. And perhaps to use email, you can send emails when you've been asked to do something, send an email clarifying, this is what we agreed, is it not? So that you have actually put down on paper in a way that is timed, dated, addressed, everything, which makes a clear statement of what you've been asked to do. So then if they change their mind and come back to you, you can say, oh, well, hang on, but I've got it written down here, or you've now asked me to do this. Again, it's using email to give yourself a paper trail. Now, the other point about that, about keeping logs and doing paper trails, is that, again, it's back to putting you in control, making you feel stronger, making you feel on top of it. What's happening here is you seem to be undermining all the time, being undermined all the time, and being told, you know, what you're saying happened, they're not agreeing with, they're not saying it, you know, they're saying something else happened. If you've got it down on paper, even if it's just your own journal, which you have dated, and maybe had someone else look at and sign, then you've got a clear record of exactly what did happen, and it puts you feeling again that you're back in control. And then when you do, if you do have to eventually go to a tribunal, you've got it all written down, you've got it all, and you can see that it's, in other words, been a diary, a log that's been kept along the way, rather than something that's just being told in the court at that particular moment. You've got proof of a trail, and I think that's really important. Puts you back in control, gives you the proof you need. Deborah.
Yes, absolutely, Susie. I'd certainly agree with that. And another thing that you could do is, if your performance is being praised by other colleagues, you're being thanked for picking up errors, for example, as this question talks about, then you've got something else to say. Not only have you got, as Susie rightly says, a paper trail on, well, you asked me to do this and I did it, but also, well, I haven't underperformed, and here's the proof. Because I've been thanked by all these other colleagues in other departments, for example, because of my good work. So anything like that you've got as well is really important evidence. Susie.
Absolutely agree with
this. I think that the more that you can involve other people, you know, the thing is that people can't bully, actually, unless they've got an audience. Sometimes bullying happens in private, in secret. And as I said, what's happening there is that person with a problem is making themselves feel better. But usually part of all this is to have that audience, to validate them, and also to sort of always back them up. Now, this happens in the schoolyard. It also happens in work. But that means that people have seen what has actually happened. When you do have a situation where there's an argument, or they are putting you down, they are being unpleasant, and they're humiliating you, belittling you, singling you out, when you write that log, make a note of who was also there. Now, if you can, ask them to send you the email that says, yes, I saw this and I didn't find it acceptable. If they're not prepared to do that, at least if you've got them written down that they were there and witnessed this, if it comes to it, they can be asked. And while they might not want to put their head above the parapet in actually making the step, they are more likely, however, to back you up and say, yes, that is actually what I saw. So I think that's worthwhile. Deborah.
Yes, I think it is a real issue sometimes getting the support of colleagues. It is difficult for employees to get the support of colleagues, particularly when proceedings become more formal. So they might agree with you, having a chat with you over the coffee machine, but they're not necessarily going to be prepared to come and be a witness in a grievance meeting, or a witness even in an employment tribunal. So it can be quite difficult. Although sometimes you can get support from employees who have left, who are quite happy to come back to support you. So that's always just something to bear in mind as well.
Yeah. And I think it's also trying to.
This question concerns somebody's boss who actually owns the company, and again, somebody who likes to undermine the employee, given excessive workload. Again, this employee hates going into work and was scared to ask anything, and also had some overtime pay withheld. and found that their personality was really transformed by the treatment that they suffered. So there's a few things different things that we haven't already mentioned that arise from this particular question. The first one that springs to my mind is the fact that the line manager in this case actually owns the company. That's going to make it very difficult for you to get an independently heard grievance. Now, companies can go and engage external HR consultants to hear grievances, but it isn't an easy situation to be in. The likelihood with this case is that your boss isn't going to be the one leaving if this ends up in a parting of the ways. And I think that that's just something to be very mindful of in this particular situation. It doesn't mean that you haven't got any redress. You can, of course, raise a grievance, and you can, of course, you do, of course, have the same employment rights as any other employee. But it's just something to be very mindful of. The other point that you raise is the issue about overtime. Now, if you've got pay that belongs to you that's being withheld from you, then you may have an unlawful deduction from wages claim. And that would be something that to explore and look into, because certainly, obviously, that should not be happening. So that's what I've got to say from a legal perspective. Susie.
Absolutely.
I think, yes, you're quite right. The boss is not going to be the person to leave. And maybe this is the sort of situation where it might be best to take a deep breath, bring, obviously, good heavens, if they're withholding pay, surely you can do something about that. But leave, and be able to do so again with your head held high, going somewhere else and saying, look, this was the problem. It wasn't that I wasn't performing, it was because of this. By the way, we've also, Jessica has made a remark, which she said, looking back to the last letter, she said, I've been trying to keep a paper trail, but my line manager told not to email, and if I do, she will not reply in writing, but will ring me or ask me to come into her office to reply verbally. Well, the point is, Jessica, however, you've got the paper trail of what you've written. Somewhere in there you might send her an email saying, I'm surprised you don't want me to email, that you want me to do all this verbally. You've got that then, actually signed, sealed and delivered, as it were. Because that's rather a clear statement of trying to hide what she's doing. I would keep up the emailing, even if she doesn't reply to it. The fact that you've emailed and what you've emailed is actually quite valuable. Back to the happy bubbly lady who's a tearful mess. Get some support and help. In a situation like that, there are times when actually you can't change the situation. If you're up against a bullying boss, there often is nothing you can do unless you actually point out to them quietly, calmly, firmly, assertively, that their behaviour will cost them money because they have spent money on employing you, training you, and now you're going to leave and they're going to have to spend money on employing and training a new person. It's actually not good. It's not cost effective to have this sort of management style. It costs them in the long run. You, on the other hand, are going to leave. You're going to go somewhere else. You're going to take your skills somewhere else. And you're going to do so with your head held high. Go back to being a happy, bubbly lady, because I'll keep repeating this. It's not your fault. Bullies don't bully you because of you. They bully you because of a problem they've got. They seem to think this is going to make them strong, this is going to make them capable, this is going to make them, the big boss person, this sort of behaviour. It doesn't. It's terrible behaviour. It's not good working practice. It's certainly not good social practice. And it's not your fault. And yes, you should not put up with it. Deborah. Yeah, Deborah.
Yes, one thing I would say, and I'd be very wary about in this case, and indeed in some of the others, where the behaviour has been so extreme, is that I wouldn't want to be leaving without an agreed reference. Because if you have got somebody particularly malicious who's been employing you, and in this case it's potentially a small company, the boss may be even writing the reference. So I would want to try and agree some sort of settlement, even if it's just that you get paid what you are rightfully owed, and an agreed reference. So that's just something else to be bearing in mind if you are going to leave.
Absolutely. I do wonder, though, it's interesting how many bosses are prepared in a sense to not look at, look for a reference, if new bosses, in other words, new employers, if they have had the situation explained to them. I would hope that there are sufficient employees out there, employers out there, who actually have bullying policies, which they hold to, where they see that a happy workplace is a productive workplace, and would not, would be able to read between the lines and see the malice. Maybe I'm being very blue-skied there. I probably am. Aren't I, Deborah? You tell me.
Possibly, Susie. I think it does depend on your line of work, your employment history as a whole. If you've moved companies every 6 months, then clearly that, and you come to a new employer saying, well, I was bullied in my last employment, it may not go down terribly well. I think it's a good thing to have a reference, even if it just states dates of employment. References are often factual these days, but often HR departments will want to see a paper trail of references, and will have some questions if they're not there. So I'd be a little bit careful about going to a new employer and saying, well, I was bullied in my last employment. Yes, I'm sure there are sympathetic employers out there, but it's not necessarily something that's going to, for somebody that doesn't know you, endear you to them sort of straight away. So I think you've got to be a little bit careful about how you present that.
Absolutely,
Susie?
Of course.
Yes,
I think you're quite right there. Right, should we go on to the next question? We've got 10 minutes left.
I've been asked by my HR department to do a 360 survey with my whole team and other professionals that I worked with, but they were very reluctant. So this person asked their HR department to take some feedback, as I understand it. Now, I don't know whether that was part of a performance review or not. Perhaps the questioner would like to elaborate what the circumstances were. It will come down to what's in the policies and how that's normally conducted. If there's something in the policy that you can point to say this should be what's happening, then obviously you've got more reason to be asking for that. So perhaps the questioner would just like to elaborate on that a bit more, and we can come back to it. Just moving on to the next question on the slide. This question is, I line manage a team of 15 personnel. One member of the team constantly challenges my decisions using aggressive verbal behaviour. She had an important role in the team that meant she had to liaise with me, and she frequently left out information or told me at the last minute, so I was not able to provide the right support. So this is an interesting case, because this is where somebody, it's got a management problem really with somebody that wasn't performing, it seems to me, and that's a rather different complaint. With a case like that, I think it is a case of you've got some support from your colleagues in that they've been mentioning that they have observed the behaviour and commented on it, and it may be time to get HR involved as well, and to seek some support in managing this difficult employee. So because certainly using aggressive verbal behaviour is not an acceptable way to behave. Obviously I don't know the details, but that would be something that I would be looking for from HR to support in terms of how to perhaps resolve it internally and address this person's aggressive behaviour in that way, and support them through that if possible to do so. Susie?
This is very interesting because it underlines the fact that,
Yes, it's very interesting because it underlines the fact that while our assumption always is that bullying is from the weaker and the lower, the person in the the higher position to the person in the lower position, it's actually not always so. And anybody in a family will know this is absolutely true, that sometimes you look at children, you look at siblings, and in fact the bullying can very much be going on from the younger, smaller, who's being a lot cleverer than the older and bigger, and getting them into trouble. And this seems to be a similar situation. But you see, again, it's underlining the fact that what bullying does to you is make you feel helpless. You have someone who is a line manager who has still been rendered helpless, being made to feel out of control and powerless against somebody who is within her line management. and therefore actually can be the one who should be hauled up and disciplined if this is a disciplinary manner, but certainly can have their manner pointed out to them and be told that this is unacceptable. But the person who's writing to us has felt undermined and rendered out of control by this. Now, senior management have observed it and commented on it, but offered no other support. Maybe it's an opportunity to ask for more support, to ask for a clarification, to ask for a discussion, to get your own role clarified. Because this is what one of the ways of doing this, of course, is to look at who does what, how, why, where, how should it be working. Is this acceptable? Is this not acceptable? Let's go back to basics, in other words. And I think that would be the advice I would give. Get your mindset right. Clarify this with your colleagues. Absolutely, I agree with Deborah. Talk to the HR department. Maybe talk to the next senior person up. But then, really, in a sense, go back to the situation knowing, you're in charge. You're the line manager. This is unacceptable behaviour. Make it clear that this is unacceptable behaviour, and that is that.
Absolutely, I completely agree with that, Susie. Just moving on now to the next question. Again, this is somebody who's been belittled and spoken down to constantly. In this particular case, the bully makes a lot of money and her behaviour is excused. And this employee's role involves working for everyone in the office. But this particular person has an aggressive way of checking on what they're doing. She's spoken to, or he's spoken to, in a rude way. They recently increased their hours and were informed that this was due to the said person needing this person to be there. So they should be grateful and thankful to her. And there was a particular bad incident. And where this individual actually did challenge the bully and found that it made it much worse. So so there's quite a few issues to come out of that. Again, I think it's probably a time to be thinking about escalating it. You've tried the approach of challenging it with the person, and that hasn't helped, and that sort of backfired. And you're again in the position of where you may be thinking about taking it further and raising a grievance and seeing if you can have anything done about it. The reality is, as is the case where the line manager was also the owner of the company, where you've got an employee who's making the company a lot of money, those are typical cases where bullies do get away with it, I'm afraid. Susie?
Indeed
it is. They often do get away with it because, yes, they're more valued, as it were, than you. But the interesting situation here is the bully, on the other hand, is saying that they value the person who is writing to us and actually has increased their hours. I wonder if it feels to me as if this might be a question almost of style. In other words, the person who is doing the bullying feels that this shows their power, that shows their ability, either their masculinity or their strength or whatever. It shows their validity to the company to behave in this rather swaggering and unpleasant way. Now, there are several ways you can deal with something like this. One is to challenge it. One is to ask for help against it. The other actually is to let it go right over your head. Is to say, look, I'm doing a job here. There needs to be a paper trail here, because if you're going to be, wasting 2 days doing a report, one thing you could say to them is, I was given the wrong information. Look, I wasted the time, but I was doing my best. That actually wasn't the bully's fault. That sounds like it was the other person's, the person giving you the wrong information's fault. But if you can actually try and get a better working relationship with this person by letting their comments and their behaviour go over your head. Sometimes in families you have people who do things in certain ways and you laugh about it. Sometimes they hurt, it hurts you and you want to fight against it. Sometimes you just say, oh, for heaven's sakes, that's so-and-so, and that's the way they do it. And you, in a sense, you turn off. You let it happen. It might be that would be one way to really deal with this person is to not let it get to you. Not let it get to you. Recognise, as I said, it's their problem because this is their behaviour. But they obviously value that. They wouldn't be asking you to have extra hours if they didn't value it. May not feel like you're being very valued. Maybe you should actually say to them, "It feels as if you're valuing me, but sometimes it doesn't feel as if you do. How do you feel about me?" And see where that gets you. Now we've got 1 minute, Deborah, and that's all. Do you want to make some final comments
now? I'm conscious there are other questions that we haven't answered, but I'm informed that answers will be provided through the Family Lives website, and there'll also be on the website links to Slater and Gordon website should you require any legal advice. But I'm afraid we are out of time now, so thank you very much for listening, and I hope you found it useful. Susie.
Exactly,
and please do go to the website. Go to Family Lives, or one word, familylives.org.uk. This will actually be available there, as will other answers to all the questions that we've had. But there were quite a few participants, SB478. It's just that I'm afraid our eyes must have fallen on those particular ones, and I do apologise. We'll see if we can get around to answering your questions on the website. Do please come to familylives.org.uk and continue speaking to us. Thank you very much for being here this evening.
Thank you,
Goodbye.
Thank you very
Deborah.
much.